offering from last week, before we get to the one for today. So tell me what you remember about the purification offering, or the sin offering, your translation might say.
That if they were poor, they could give 2 birds, right?
Yes. And even if they were poorer than that, they could also bring flour.
Oh,
right? So you remember with the purification offering, there were different offerings based on, first on the status of the person, whether you the high priest, or whether it was the community, or whether you were a leader, or whether you were a lay person. And then it was broken down even further by what you could afford. So there were options for bringing birds or flour if you were too poor to bring something. Yeah, what else with the purification?
Did the flour offering have salt?
No, I don't think so. I think that's just the regular grain offering. That's the one that includes salt, but I don't think this one does. It doesn't mention it, but it did exclude, do you remember that it did exclude oil and incense? I think, I don't know for sure, but I think because those things are typically included in an offering where you're celebrating something or you're joyful about something, which you're not when you bring a purification offering. So those things are
to be a pleasing aroma.
not in the sense of like, yeah, I mean, you're right, not in the sense that you're just bringing a voluntary offering to celebrate what the Lord has done for you. No, you're bringing it because,
You see,
that's right,
you're coming with a contrite heart
that's right,
instead of a joyful,
yes,
praising.
that's right. All right, what else? What else do you remember from the purification offering? What did they do with the blood? So they would sprinkle it in the tabernacle if it was for the high priest or for the community, and then they put it on the horns of the altar of incense. If it was for a leader or for a lay person, they wouldn't go into the tabernacle, but they would put it on the horns of the altar outside, because the whole picture is that you're purifying things from impurity and sin. Yep. And then whatever was left, you splash it, you pour it, or I think you pour it out at the base of the altar.
Times.
What was the purification offering for? I mean, I know it's for sin, but do you remember?
To restore fellowship with God.
And do you remember the specific kinds of sins that it mentioned for purification offerings?
Well, no, not false word, not testifying when you should speak up.
Right.
Touching an unclean thing.
Yep. So there were like these 2 categories. The first one was unintentional sins, and then the other category was intentional but non-defiant. So it includes things like sins of omission, sins of neglect, sins of procrastination, sins of forgetfulness, all that kind of thing. So the purification offering covers all that. And it's purification because there's this idea that things get polluted by sin. Remember that illustration of acid, which we're going to get to later when we get to the whole thing about skin diseases. That idea that sin has a corroding, corrupting effect, and the sacrifice is required to stop the corrosion and corruption that's caused by sin. So there's this purification idea, this picture of purification that comes. Okay, anything else you want to add from last week? Okay, so let's look at the bit that comes next. So this next section, we're going to look at chapter 5, verse 14 through chapter 6, verse 7. This section covers the last of the 5 offerings. So there's 5 major offerings, and then as we go through the rest of Leviticus, you'll see that these offerings sometimes get modified for certain occasions, but these are the 5 basic offerings, and here's the last one. Okay, so chapter 5, verse 14. The Lord said to Moses, when a person commits a violation and sins unintentionally in regard to any of the Lord's holy things, he is to bring to the Lord as a penalty a ram from the flock, one without defect, and of the proper value in silver according to the sanctuary shekel. It is a guilt offering. He must make restitution for what he has failed to do in regard to the holy things, add a fifth of the value to that, and give it all to the priest, who will make atonement for him with the ram as a guilt offering, and he will be forgiven. If a person sins and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, even though he does not know it, he is guilty and will be held responsible. He is to bring to the priest as a guilt offering a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him for the wrong he has committed unintentionally, and he will be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. He has been guilty of wrongdoing against the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving his neighbor about something entrusted to him or left in his care or stolen, or if he cheats him, or if he finds lost property and lies about it, or if he swears falsely, or if he commits any such sins that people may do, when he thus sins and becomes guilty, he must return what he has stolen or taken by extortion, or what was entrusted to him, or the lost property he found, or whatever it was he swore falsely about. He must make restitution in full, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day he presents his guilt offering. And as a penalty, he must bring to the priest, that is, to the Lord, his guilt offering, a ram from the flock, one without defect and of the proper value. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord, and he will be forgiven for any of these things he did that made him guilty. Okay, so how does this next section start in verses 14 and 15?
Now we're bringing a financial value into it.
Yeah. How does it describe things the sin that is the occasion for this in verses 14 and 15? Being unfaithful to the Lord by doing what?
By being unintentional.
Well, and these are sins against your neighbor. Neighbors, aren't they? Specifically
Yes, but did you notice what it
extortion?
says in verse 15? It's a sin unintentional in regard to what?
The Lord's holy things.
A breach of faith because you've sinned against the Lord's holy things. Okay, now that's the overarching topic of this whole section, which is really interesting. Now, let's just talk about the name of this offering. So my translation says guilt offering. Your translation might say a trespass offering. Those things aren't wrong, but as was the case with the previous offering, that name is too general, which is going to make things confusing later. And the reason I say that is when we get to the sacrifices, for example, for someone who has a skin disease, one of the things they have to do is to bring a guilt offering. Well, why do you have to bring a guilt offering for a skin disease? I mean, you didn't commit a sin. You're not guilty of doing something wrong. Well, here's the thing. Just like with the sin offering, which is more precisely a purification offering, the guilt offering is more precisely a reparation offering, or you could call it a compensation offering. Now, that word, reparation or compensation, has in it the sense of repairing something that's been damaged or broken. And it's important that it starts again, like with the purification offering, this one starts again, not by talking about the animal for the sacrifice, but the occasion for it, which is a particular breaking of God's commands. So both of these offerings, the purification offering and the reparation offering, or the guilt offering, they're atoning sacrifices, but they have different emphases. So the purification offering emphasizes the polluting effects of sin. The reparation offering emphasizes the damaging effects of sin. So for relationship with God to be restored, both the pollution and the damage of sin have to be addressed. And the damage is what we're looking at now in this last offering. And it's damage it's damage both horizontally and vertically, as we're going to see. Okay, now the occasion for this is interesting because he says, first of all, a person's unfaithful, or there's a breach of loyalty or covenant. My translation says a violation. But it literally says in verse 15 that someone has been unfaithful to the Lord by sinning intentionally against his holy, or unintentionally in regard to his holy things. Now, that's important because, well, first off, we're dealing with a category of sin to start with that's inadvertent, that's unintentional. But to sin against the Lord's holy things, what does that mean? Well, his holy things are the things that have been set apart for him. Now, we're going to get a whole list of these when we get to chapter 27, like animals and houses and land and tithes. But the most obvious way that you could sin unintentionally regarding the Lord's holy things is by eating holy food that you shouldn't be eating. And we've been talking about a whole lot with the sacrifices about, when it's most holy or holy, there are distinctions about who can eat it, who can touch it. The priests only get certain portions, the worshipers only get certain portions. So here's the thing, if you eat food that's holy, that it's been set apart, for the Lord for a particular purpose, well, if you do it purposely, you get cut off from the nation. If you do it unintentionally, this is how you deal with it. It's a big deal. And you could also do it by eating, from the first fruits. Remember, we talked about the first fruits back when we had the grain offering, that the Lord's going to get to that later in Leviticus, but there's a certain part of your harvest that you put aside first for the Lord. Well, let's say you put the harvest aside first, you put it aside and you're going to take it to the Lord, and then one of your kids comes along and starts helping himself. Okay, so what's happened? He's eating the portion that actually belongs to the Lord, but it's an unintentional. You're not being defiant or rebellious. You're just eating something that you shouldn't have been eating because it belongs to God instead. So that's not the only way you could do this sin unintentionally against the Lord's holy things, but that's one of the most obvious ways. Now, it's important that he says right here that someone is unfaithful to the Lord, or he commits a violation or a breach of loyalty to the Lord. The reason is because using that word, when someone's unfaithful to the Lord in regard to these things, that's a word that's used to describe betrayal or treachery. And it's used to describe situations of adultery and idolatry. There's a clear indication right there in verse 15 that what we're dealing with right here is something a lot more serious than just accidentally eating somebody else's lunch. It's a breach of covenant loyalty that is a betrayal of the Lord, because it's his stuff that you're disrespecting. So let me read something for you. To show disrespect to someone's property is to show disrespect to its owner. Well, you know that. If your property gets disrespected, you feel disrespected, right? If ancient Israelites disrespected the Lord's property in some way, such as treating something holy as an everyday item or by using it for a wrong purpose, they were actually disrespecting the Lord himself. This was viewed as a serious act of unfaithfulness against the covenant. In the ancient Near East, a person could atone for this kind of breach of covenant loyalty by acknowledging their wrong and then paying an appropriate penalty. The penalty served as a ransom payment. It was a mitigated penalty in place of the one which was deserved. And in this case, the reparation offering serves as a ransom payment. This section then describes 3 different acts of unfaithfulness in which the holy property of the Lord is profaned. Okay, do you get the sense? This is really serious. Basically, you profane the holy things that belong to the Lord, your life is forfeit. Like, it's that big of a deal. And so this offering, the picture of this offering is of a ransom payment, a ransom that is buying your life back for having profaned what should not have been profaned because it belongs to the Lord. I mean, as a commoner, you don't treat the king that way. And so how much less do you treat the Lord that way? Okay, now, what's the sacrifice for this kind of sin in verse 15?
A ram from the flock.
Yes, and it has to be a male, without defect. What else does it add right there?
Proper value in silver.
Now that's interesting. We haven't seen that sort of thing mentioned before, right? Now, why does it have to be the proper value of silver, and what does that even mean? To say that it has to be the proper value in silver means it has to be the going rate for a ram without defect. So it's kind of like, if you go down to the sale barn to buy a horse, what's the going rate for this particular kind of horse? There would be a standard rate. And that's the idea that you're getting at right here, is what's the going rate for a male sheep without defect. Whatever it is that you bring for this offering, it has to be of that value. And he mentions by the standard of the sanctuary shekel, because that's what they used that's how they measured their currency. Now, why does that matter? Why does it have to be of a particular value? Because it's serving as a ransom payment. That's why it matters, the value of the sheep. And you might have noticed as we go through this, there's not a different payment provided depending on who you are. The ransom payment is the same for everybody, and it has to be of a particular value.
What would the poor do?
Well,
alongside?
somebody could come alongside you, or you would have to save up.
What did you ask, Sue?
What do the poor do?
Oh, yeah. Sally, is this like the jumping off point for the Pharisees and carry wood or you get whatever, how all the values they assigned all the added laws? Is that where they're like,
I think when you talk about the Pharisees and the added laws, I think what they're trying to do is to justify themselves by, basically, they're making loopholes, is what they're doing. Is they're adding on to things where they say, okay, this is exactly how we know we kept it, or how we didn't. And then you can tick off the box and say, look, I did all of the stuff, I'm good. I think that's more of what's happening with the Pharisees, when they're adding, laws about how far you can walk and how much you can do on the Sabbath and how, what.
so did the priest assign, who assigned fair market price or the market?
The market did.
But,
Right.
but somebody has to evaluate that.
Yeah, well, it would be the priest who would say, I mean, if you bring a defective lamb, it's the priest who is supposed to say, wait, you can't bring that.
Yeah.
So that's why, when you get to the book of Malachi and people are bringing defective animals, the first people who get harangued by the Lord are the priests. Because it was their job to teach the people what was acceptable and what wasn't, and to be the gatekeepers at the temple to make sure that people were not bringing things they shouldn't be. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay,
And
yeah.
what defines perfection? I mean, if they look for blemishes, was it blemishes?
It's not in the sense that you can't have I don't think it means you can't have a spot. I mean, if you have a calf and it has a white spot at its forehead, that's not a blemish. But it's that it can't be deformed, right? It can't be lame,
No conformity.
right? It can't be sick, like that kind of thing. You're not gonna bring something that would be cheaper because it's not whole or it's not healthy.
Okay.
So in the context of this, you're bringing a ram without defect. Is there a different way, or, I mean, two rams both without defect, that one would be valued more than the other that how could it, I guess my question is, how could it not be of the value that is, if it's a ram without defect, how could it not already be of that value?
Because you could have rams that are more valuable based on their lineage,
Okay,
based on how old they are,
okay, age or, weight
based
or
on,
something.
breeding value, that kind of thing.
Okay,
That's why you could have a ram without defect but of a different value.
okay,
So it's not necessarily that you bring the absolutely most expensive ram possible. It's just whatever's the typical going rate for an adult male sheep without defect.
you bring the one that is of that value.
That's right.
Okay,
So
that makes
health-
sense, thank you.
So healthy, not a sick animal also.
Right.
Not only physical defects, but illness.
Yes, because you're not using the sacrifice to get rid of the animals you don't want.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Okay, now, let's look at the instructions that come next. So what does he add in verse 16?
He shall make restitution, so he has to, if he has damaged something, he has to pay it back,
Mm-hmm.
plus a fifth of its value goes to the priest.
Right. So the assumption then is that this is an offense that would involve a literal quantifiable debt, which calls for literal restitution if that's possible. So they have to replace whatever they used or pay what they owe, depending on the situation, and then add a fifth onto it. Now, in the case of a holy food item, that would mean replacing the item and adding 20%.
And adding 20%, fifth of that.
A fifth, 20%, that's right. Now, what's interesting about this is that that percentage is actually far less than the penalties for other sins. So, for example, in Exodus 22, it says, if a thief was caught before confessing, the repayment penalties could range anywhere from 200 to 500%. So if you stole your neighbor's sheep and you got caught with it, instead of voluntarily coming and, saying, I did this, the penalty was a lot higher.
And who determined that?
Well,
The penalty, yeah.
whoever the judge would be in the
The
case, which would
judge.
often be, not always, it would often be a priest, but it could
Yeah, 'cause
also
they
be,
didn't have judges here yet, did they?
well, there were elders, or there were
Elders.
particular
Okay.
people that Moses
Yeah.
had delegated some
Yeah.
of that work to, so whoever's functioning as the judge would do that. If there was actually a legal case where someone had gotten caught. Now, the lesser penalty in this instance, I think, is probably due to the fact that the item was taken by mistake, or it was eaten by mistake, and then the sinner realized it and confessed. And since it had been taken from the holy things which belong to the priest, the sinner naturally brings the payment to the one who's been wronged, who's the priest. And then the priest makes atonement for them through the sacrifice of the ram as the reparation offering, and they're forgiven.
Now, I'm gonna ask this again, I asked it last week or the week before. Sacrifices are only done at the temple. And we're talking about a large group of people living in a vast area. So these, I'm assuming that these types of sins are gonna be relatively commonplace. And so does this person have to travel to the temple in order to make this sacrifice?
Yes,
Yes?
but you don't have to make the sacrifice every time you commit the sin.
Okay. So on your once a year
Yes.
trip to the temple, you're keeping a tally sheet.
Perhaps you keep in a tally, but what you know is, okay, so you bring a purification offering for your family once a year. Okay, you know that offering covers the sins of all the people in that family for the entire time that you haven't been
Yeah.
to the tabernacle or the temple.
But from that point that was recognized, they could no longer participate.
Right, that's the
Okay.
thing, is if
All
you,
right.
if you want to
Yeah.
come and participate in Passover celebrations at the tabernacle, and you've committed this kind of sin, you can't participate until you've offered this offering.
Well, but if I live 50 miles away from the tabernacle,
Mhm.
Weren't there synagogues? Like,
not
isn't
not-
every
these are
town?
the desert people. These
I
are-
know, but didn't Jesus
There will-
go in and preach
Yes.
and study in every town?
Yes, there are synagogues later, but they are not places of sacrifice. They're not allowed to sacrifice at the synagogues. They have to sacrifice at the tabernacle or the temple. And we'll actually get to that later in Leviticus, that God is very adamant. That the fact is, when all this instruction is given, the people are actually making sacrifices wherever they want, out in the wilderness, and the Lord says, now that ends now.
Okay.
If you have a sacrifice, you have to bring it to the
temple.
tabernacle.
So that's,
To the tabernacle.
Because he has very particular ways that he wants this done, and because you have to go through a priest. Why do you have to go through a priest?
Because there has to be a mediator.
And why does there have to be a mediator?
Because we're cut off from God at that point.
Yeah.
And who's your mediator?
Jesus.
So part of the reason he's so particular about all of this is because it's foreshadowing things that are coming in the gospel. So there's a point in saying to the Israelites, you cannot bring a sacrifice without a priest. Because if you don't have a mediator, you can't come into the presence of a holy God.
okay, Sally, is there a sacrifice police?
That just keeps going.
Well,
brain.
this is
Who
the
tells
problem
me?
that shows up when you read, for example, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, is that the people are sacrificing on the high places.
Yeah.
And so there's even one of the kings later, well, a lot of the kings put up with it.
Yeah.
So when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, this is one of the things that gets repeated over and over, is that the king worshipped the Lord, but he did not stop the sacrifices on the high places.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? It means that there are people following the pagan practices of just sacrificing on this hill or that mountain or under this tree,
Without
when the Lord has
mediator.
said, absolutely not. because there are things he's communicating through this ritual that are intended to point to Christ. And you start to lose the meaning of that ritual if you just do it wherever and whenever and however you want.
Well, I'm looking at this and trying to figure out, you know, if I've been to the tabernacle for Passover in April, and I do something stupid in May, and I have to wait until I can go back to the tabernacle next April, that means I have to pack that around in my heart for 11 months.
So
It's
here's,
still a matter of the heart.
yes, because here's the thing. The offering of the sacrifice is not what ultimately gives you forgiveness. Right? It's confession and the fact that God forgives you. That's where you get the forgiveness. So why do you have to do the sacrifice? Because how long does it take you to forget what it costs God to forgive you? So it's not that the lamb gets you the forgiveness.
Right.
It's that the lamb reminds you of how you get forgiveness. Right? So it's not that you can't be forgiven of this sin until you show up at the tabernacle 11 months from now. But it's that going through this process is something God requires so that you don't just come to atonement thinking, I say I'm sorry and we're good. So it costs. Atonement costs. And the people have to have that put in front of them over and over and over, because how long does it take you to be flippant and casual about forgiveness when there's nothing put in front of you that says it costs God for you to have right fellowship with Him.
So you did do something and you unintentionally, so maybe you don't know about it. How does that work?
We're going to get to that in like 2 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Have I forgotten it? Is it in the verse?
Okay.
So with the restitution part, in restoring, say I stole something from Marilyn, can I make that restitution to her before I go do the sacrifice?
So we're going to get to that in about 4 minutes. Okay. It's coming. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is about presenting the sacrifice to the priest. A woman couldn't do that, right?
Yes, a woman can bring,
Okay,
a woman she can't be the priest, but she can bring a sacrifice.
okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was wondering.
Yeah. It's really interesting, since you mentioned Hannah. Hannah's really interesting because when you read that story where she makes her vow to the Lord, then she has Samuel, and she doesn't go back to the tabernacle until the day when she's going to hand him over, right? And assuming that would have been about he would have been about 3-ish. And what's interesting is that when she goes back, she hasn't been there for like 3 years. When she comes back, the text says she brings with her a bull, a 3-year-old bull. Or you could actually translate that 3 1-year-old bulls. Either way, you can translate it. Why would it mention the 3?
For every year.
That's right. Now, isn't that interesting? She doesn't go to the tabernacle for 3 years, but when she shows up, she brings an offering that indicates it's been 3 years since she was there.
Okay, interesting.
Now, God doesn't require that, but isn't that a natural way to think about it? If you make a regular yearly pilgrimage and then you don't go for 3 years, it's like now you bring a sacrifice that shows that there's 3 years represented by this sacrifice.
But wouldn't her husband have gone?
Yes, but it was her vow.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And so when she goes with the bull, she takes a bull to fulfill this vow that she had made to the Lord along with Samuel. Yeah. Okay. Now, there's the first kind of sin that we're addressing where the priest makes atonement for you with the sacrifice of the ram, the reparation, the violation of the holy things. Okay, now, verses 17 to 19 address a second situation of inadvertent sin, which I found a bit odd, but I think it would have been completely normal to the Israelites, and this is right back to what you were asking, Susan. So, continuing in the context of misusing holy things. If anyone sins and breaks the Lord's commands without knowing it, They are guilty and they will bear their iniquity. Now, there are two different understandings of this law, and your translation might reflect one or the other. So, in the first understanding, it could be that a person does not know they've sinned, but then they learn that they sinned and they deal with it properly. Some of the translations reflect that kind of understanding. That approach is possible, although what's not clear is why repayment would not be mentioned here if you've realized what you've done. There's another understanding of it, which is that the person suspects they've sinned, but they never learn what the sin is. That's the standard way the rabbis interpreted it, and it's followed by a lot of the commentators. And the advantage of that is that it explains why there's no repayment mentioned, because the sinner never learns what the sin is, and they don't know what the repayment should be.
Now, wait a minute. I've sinned, and I know I've sinned, but I don't know what I did.
I suspect I sinned, but I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, let me keep going for a second, okay? Now, that fits well with the fact that the Israelites were actually very fearful of inadvertently committing sins and not knowing it. And that fear was not just common for them, it was common in the whole of the ancient Near East. Okay, now let me just read a little bit of background for you. This is an instance of a suspected trespass against sacred property, which was one of the most dreaded sins in antiquity. Someone suspected they sinned, but they didn't know exactly how, and in their uncertainty they would fear the worst. And a reparation offering was thus the offering that they could bring. The sacrifice deals with conscience. It deals with a matter where you are not sure what you've done, but you think that you have. Now, why would you think that you had sinned if you didn't know what the sin was? Well, there were instances where God might actually bring judgment against somebody through their physical circumstances. And there are instances of that in the Old Testament where, particularly when you think about the covenant blessings and the covenant curses, you know, if Israel started to experience a drought, okay, if they go back to the covenant blessings and covenant curses, the first thing they should realize is that the reason for this drought is because they're on the wrong side of their God. Now, there could be other reasons why that sort of thing happened, and it's, yeah, there's different examples in the Old Testament, but they could experience a plague, they could experience, you know, barrenness with the women, they could experience drought and all kinds of stuff. And what's going on? Well, if they start to fear, we're on the wrong side of God, but we don't know how. This is one of the ways to deal with that, is to bring a reparation offering to say, if we sinned against him and we don't know how, here's the offering that will make things right between him and us. Or it could be, there was a woman a couple weeks ago in Bible study who said, I've sometimes just had an experience of conscience where I think I'm on the wrong side of God and I don't really know why. And I'm trying, and she said, and I was praying, I'm like, Lord, what is it? Like, there's something that it seems like you and I something's not right. She said, so, it's interesting to think they actually had an offering to deal with that. Okay, now, if some of that sounds a bit like primitive or far-fetched, let me read for you from the New Testament. So, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, you know the Corinthians and how crazy they were, but here's Paul talking about the Lord's Supper. And so in 1 Corinthians 11:27, he says, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. A man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. Do you see how he's describing exactly what's being talked about in Leviticus? Is there's an offense against the holy thing, and what's the holy thing in that context? Christ, right? The idea that you're going to communion and you are treating the elements of the Lord's Supper as something casual, like as if you're just going to a picnic. And that's an offense against Christ and against the holy things of God, where Paul says, God does not let that go. And so it sounds like there were Corinthians who were actually suffering physical problems and didn't know that the reason that was happening was because of how disrespectful they were being to Jesus when they came to the Lord's Supper. Yeah? I mean, again, a thing where you're inadvertently sinning against the holy things, and now how do you know that you're doing it? Because you're starting to experience some kind of physical problem that is, according to Paul, is a judgment from the Lord. Now, we know there are all kinds of illnesses that have nothing to do with judgment for particular sin. But there are indications sometimes that happens. Sometimes God uses physical problems to get our attention about a sin. The same thing happens, or it shows up in James 5, when James says, if any of you are sick, go to the elders and have them pray for you. And if you're guilty of a sin, you'll be forgiven. Wait, what? So you're suffering a physical problem, you go to the elders, they pray for you, and you're forgiven? Well, again, it's not because all illnesses are a direct result of sin. We don't want to say that because we've read the book of Job. But there are some times when that is the case, when God uses physical problems to get our attention about a sin. And that happened in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. So if somebody starts to think, I'm having this problem and maybe I'm on the wrong side of God, well, how do you satisfy your conscience about that? You take a reparation offering and deal with it.
That was my question while you're talking is, boy, this side of the cross, hearts are really cauterized with social and this and that, and we don't realize the importance of a clean heart. And then I think of Psalms when it talks about when we pray, we better have a clean heart. And then I'm thinking about how I followed Chris Beats Cancer, and the first thing he says is, and he's talking to those who are not believers, and he says, check your heart for bitterness as far as and because these things do affect our bodies, not saying it, but check for areas where you have cauterized your own heart from what he's talking about here. It really makes sense.
And are there not even times when when you're trying to confess sin and you can't even remember all the stuff you did, right? Or you're thinking, there's stuff I did and I wasn't even aware of it. And now I can't even list it all off because how much stuff have I forgotten since I got up this morning? Do you have to remember every single thing you did in order to be forgiven? No, you have to depend on the reparation offering. What's your reparation offering? Christ, right? So if you start to think, I think I'm on the wrong side of God, or maybe I'm suffering because of a sin I don't realize, or whatever. Okay, what do? You go to Christ, right? You plead the reparation offering that Christ provides for you. Now I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so there was the second category. Okay, third category of sin. Back to what you were saying, Sherry, in chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. So what does he mention here in this third category?
The Lord spoke to Moses, if anyone sins and commits or trespasses against the Lord, deals falsely with his neighbor in a manner of deposit given him to keep, or bargain, or has oppressed his neighbor, or found what was lost and lied about it, or swears falsely so that he sins in the things in which men do, and sin is so doing.
Okay, stop right there, because there's the sins. Now let's talk about the sins first. This final category is about profaning the name of the Lord through a false oath. Now, because of the way my translation reads, it actually took me a while to figure out that was the major offense going on right here. The major offense is not deceit or theft or cheating or lying, although all those things are important. The major offense is misusing the name of the Lord to cover up that stuff. That's why all these things are listed in a context that deals with the misuse of holy things, because the name of God is holy, and misusing his name is a serious offense against him. So, unlike the previous two categories, this is an intentional sin, but it's non-defiant. Okay, now let's talk about that. So think about these examples. All these the examples that are listed here are situations that involve fraud of some sort, right? So you lost or damaged something, somebody entrusted to you, you stole something, you cheated somebody, you found lost property, and then you lied about it. And here's the thing, what all those sins have in common is that without some tangible evidence, they can be really hard to prove. And, you know, they don't have fingerprints, right? They can't take fingerprints, the Israelites. And so say that you, you know, you steal your neighbor's sheep, or it was entrusted to you for safekeeping, and then you decided to eat it while your neighbor was gone. Well, if you eat it, there's no evidence left, right? I mean, you could take something like that, use it up, and there's no evidence to prove that you did it. And so in instances like that, where a person was suspected, but the evidence was lacking, it was actually common in the ancient Near East for the case to be settled by having the person who was accused take an oath in the name of the Lord and basically invite judgment onto themselves if they were guilty. And you hear versions of that in the Old Testament when people say, "May the Lord judge me, be it ever so severely," if Exodus 22 actually lists a bunch of different cases where that kind of oath is appropriate. Where basically you come to a point where you think this person's guilty, but there's no way to prove it. And so the end point is the person takes an oath and says, okay, if I did it, let God judge me.
Yeah.
Okay, now if you're doing that in a nation where you have a fake God, well, who cares? But if you're doing that with the living God, okay, that's a big deal to actually say, may the Lord judge me if I did this. And the thing was, the Lord had told the people he would. That he would make it right if somebody was getting away with something like that, the Lord would bring judgment on them. Okay, now, here's the thing. You can probably see how easily that sort of thing could be abused. If you were to just go to court and be like, okay, I take this oath and then I'm off scot-free. Yeah, you could do that. You could be somebody who's guilty and you take the oath to get yourself off the hook. That's the thing that's being addressed here. That someone swears rashly by the name of the Lord to protect themselves or to avoid having their sin found out. So it's not just the fraud that's the problem, which it is, but it's the fact that they disrespect the Lord by misusing his name to cover up their sin.
That feels intentional and defiant. Like, how is that not, I mean, how does it work that it's in this one where it's saying it's non-defiant?
Because the assumption is that you voluntarily come and admit what you did, rather than somebody figuring it out later and saying, hey, I can prove it now. I mean, the thing is, how could you prove it? That the whole reason you take this oath is because nobody can prove it.
Right.
So the assumption is you voluntarily come and say, you know what? I was lying when I did that. The fact that you're willing to come and admit it and to pay the restitution is what makes it non-defiant.
Okay.
So in the same way we saw with the purification offering, confession
Okay.
is one of the things that makes a sin non-defiant. In this case, the fact that you come and voluntarily pay restitution is what makes the sin non-defiant. So there's a sense in which you're being defiant when you sit there and lie in court. But if you show remorse and you come back and you say, okay, I'm going to make it right, that's a different kind of attitude where you're agreeing with God about your sin and you're saying, okay, I'm going to deal with it the way the Lord says to.
Gotcha.
Okay, now, if in verses 4 and 5, if anyone commits that sort of sin and then they later come to their senses and admit what they did, what's the first thing they have to do?
Restoration.
Yep, they have to make restitution to the person they defrauded. So they have to return whatever they stole or found or kept, whatever it was that they swore falsely about. So the reason I say that all of this falls under a misuse of the name of the Lord is because of verse 5. All of this is included in something that you made a false oath about. So they have to make restitution to the person they defrauded plus a fifth of the value again. And they have to do all of that before they bring their reparation offering to the Lord. What? Why? Why do you think you have to make the restitution before you bring your sacrifice?
You're making it right.
Yeah.
Accounting for your sin.
Yes. Yep. So here's a demonstration of repentance. So there are all kinds of people who I think would just come and say to God, okay, what do I have to do for, to sort this out? Well, one of the things God says is you can't sort it out with him until you sort it out with the people that you wronged. So you have to deal with that wrong and then bring your sacrifice. So restitution, well, we saw before restitution was made to the priest because it was his food, for example, that was eaten. And here the restitution is made to the person who's had their property taken. And in the middle case, of course, there's no reparation because the offense is unknown. Now, it's again significant that the amount of restitution required in this case is significantly lower than elsewhere in the law, where it would have been 200 or 300% or more. Because this is a situation where someone doesn't get caught, they voluntarily come forward and admit what they did. So again, it's intentional, but the fact that they're remorseful and they make voluntary restitution demonstrates their repentance. When I read this, I thought about the story of Zacchaeus. So, you know, when Zacchaeus, when Jesus invites himself to go home with Zacchaeus for lunch, and after the meal, Zacchaeus stands up in front of all these people, and you know, he's an IRS agent, and so he stands up in front of all these people, and then he says, I'm going to give half of what I own to the poor, and anybody who I've wronged, and there's probably a bunch of them, given his job, he says, anybody I've wronged, I will pay back what I owe times 4. And it's really interesting that when Jesus hears that, the next thing he says is, today salvation has come to this house. Why? Did Zacchaeus just buy his way into the kingdom of God?
No.
No, it's because that kind of voluntary restitution is a demonstration of repentance, and Jesus recognizes it for what it is. And he realizes, here's a guy who got converted. Because why else would he stand up in front of all those people and be like, I'm going to make it right, times 4, to anybody I wronged. Yeah. Okay, now, what do the instructions say then in verses 6 and 7?
Bring a ram without blemish,
Mm-hmm.
and then it says, what is equivalent for a guilt offering? What's an equivalent?
It's the proper value.
Like money?
So I would say, so your translation says or
Yeah.
the equivalent, and mine says and of the proper value. So I think what we're getting at here is that the ram has to be of a particular value. If you don't have that ram, you could bring the silver, and I don't think that you could actually just offer the silver to the priest, but you could use the silver to buy the appropriate sacrifice. Does that make sense?
Oh, you
So if you're coming from a long ways away and you don't have a goat, or you don't want to haul it 50 miles, you bring this amount of silver, whatever's the going rate, and you can buy the sacrifice that you need.
And then that has implications forward into what was happening at the temple when Jesus cleared the temple.
Yeah,
Because there were sellers of livestock there that were overcharging.
yeah, they're cheating people. Right.
How do you add a fifth to a bull? The money?
The money.
Whatever the rate would be for the bull, whatever you have gotten,
Fifth, you couldn't just.
and then you
bring
add
a
a fifth
calf.
onto it. No, well, that's right. If you eat somebody's cow, like a full, you know, you can't bring a little tiny calf to replace it.
Well, I mean,
Right.
with
Yeah.
the bull to be the fifth.
Well, maybe. Depends on how much the calf is worth, right?
Pedigree. Yeah.
But you see how in all of this, there should be an incentive for people to voluntarily come and admit what they did instead of trying to hide it. Because it's like God saying, okay, you still have to make restitution, but there's mercy in this, because the restitution is not nearly what it will be if you refuse to come forward and then you get caught, which is, yeah,
You know,
not dealt with here, but dealt with in
One of
this
the things that I just so appreciate about Covenant Presbyterian is that in their order of service, they have confession. Of all the churches I've been to, they've never had that. And I really love that time and the fact that I'm not going to get anything out of the message, I don't think, until I make things right. That's how I feel. And I appreciate that.
But you start by dealing with your sin.
Yeah.
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 Just like you do before having communion.
Yeah. So, you know, restitution's only half of the equation, because you still have to deal with the fact that you sinned against the name of the Lord. So in a sense, you have to make restitution this way first, and then you have to make restitution this way. Because you're bringing to the Lord a ransom payment for yourself for having misused his property, which includes his name, his holy name. So, so the person brings, as a penalty for their sin, they bring this reparation offering, this ram without defect of the proper value. All the other instructions are assumed. The worshiper leans his hand on the head of the animal, slaughters it, the priest burns the appropriate portions, and in that way the priest makes atonement for them before the Lord, and they're forgiven, both for the fraud against their neighbor and for the offense against the Lord for misusing his name. Okay, now, what kinds of things are emphasized in those instructions? Well, as with the purification offering, it's the sin that's emphasized, and the fact that offenses that might look minor on the surface have to be addressed if people want to live in right relationship to the Lord. And that includes how the holy things and the holy name of the covenant king are used by his people. That's a big deal. And it has to be dealt with in worship. And the fact that everybody's life, if this sacrifice stands in as a ransom for your life, it makes sense that everybody pays the same, right? And actually, I'm not sure that would have been the case in all cultures, but it's important that a poor person and a rich person, their life is worth the same when it comes to a ransom. A man and a woman, their life is worth the same. Doesn't matter. Everybody's ransom payment is the same. And the reparation offering draws attention to the fact that sin has both a social and a spiritual dimension. It affects our relationship with our neighbors, and it also affects our relationship with God. And it has to be dealt with in both of those ways for us to be in right relationship with him. So the burnt offering brings reconciliation between God and man. The purification offering brings purification. The reparation offering brings a satisfaction of a debt. It satisfies the debt of paying God for your sin. Okay, now on that note, I'm already getting into what's the purpose of the offering. It's this picture of you are in debt to God. You have a debt that has to be paid, and the debt is yourself. Now, how could you ever how could you ever repay God what you owe? You have debts against God. What could you ever offer to the Lord as the repayment that you owe to him? Well, here's the thing. Who pays our debt to God? Jesus does, right? We already talked about this. Now, in Isaiah 53, so you know Isaiah 53 is that description of the Lord as the suffering servant, the Messiah. Listen to what it says in verse 10. Isaiah 53:10. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Now when it says the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, the word he uses right there is the word for a reparation offering. So Isaiah uses the word, you could translate it, and though the Lord makes his life a reparation offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Now think about the weight of that in calling Jesus the reparation offering. Jesus pays the debt you owe with his life, right? Jesus is the ransom that buys you back, that buys back your life from having sinned against the Lord and his holiness. It's Jesus who cancels everything that stands against you. It makes me think of that bit in Colossians when Paul says, God nailed our debt to the cross. He nailed to it the legal code that stood against us. He nailed it to the cross when Jesus died, and that's how we get free of the debt that we owe. Jesus is our reparation. Okay. How are these things applicable to us? Why does it matter?
I was just thinking about what Susan just said about the confession and that in our service. And I think too that in this lesson, Scott always reminds us to be right with the Lord before we're taking communion. It's something that needs to be done.
Yeah. And it's not because you have to confess all known sin.
Right.
It's that you have to come to it with a recognition of the weight of what you're about to do and what it represents about Jesus and what he's done. That you can't ever be flippant about the bread and the wine, because the gravity of what it represents is so, so important.
Just the thought that Jesus paid that ransom.
Mhm.
And I don't have to go through all that other stuff.
Yeah. We'll talk about this again next week, but there's a commentator I read who said, why do you have to have 5 different sacrifices? And he said it's kind of like if you read an anatomy book, which probably most of you haven't for a long time, maybe some of you have lately, but you know in an anatomy book, when you get the diagrams of the human body, and you'll get a diagram that has your skeletal system, and then a different diagram that has your cardiovascular system, and then a different one that has your nerves, and a different one that has your muscles. Why do you have to have so many diagrams? Because there are so many layers to the human body that you can't get a hold of everything that's there with one picture, right? You have to have pictures that show you the layers, or it's just, you can't see it all. And he said the same thing is going on with the sacrifices. Why do you have to have 5 sacrifices? Because the layers of what Christ has done for you cannot be understood with one sacrifice. There are too many nuances to sin and too many nuances to forgiveness and salvation to deal with that sin to understand it in one sacrifice. But doesn't there come a point where you get to the end of the 5th sacrifice and you're like, ugh, all these sacrifices. Can't there just be one that takes care of everything? Yeah, there is. And it's Jesus. But you won't get all the layers of meaning to those sacrifices, to that sacrifice, without seeing them basically picked apart. You see the components separated out, so that when you see all those sacrifices, you realize, you come to Jesus and you plead his blood. What are you getting? You're getting atonement, you're getting ransom, you're getting purification. Like you're getting all this stuff that those sacrifices accomplish. You get it in the one person of Jesus. Does that not increase for you the weight of even when you pray and ask for forgiveness, the weight of what it is that Christ has provided for you? Because you see, even all these sacrifices, why is all that necessary? Because sin is heavy, but the sacrifice of Jesus is heavier. And it covers all of that in order to put us in right relationship with God. All right, any last things? Any comments you want to add? Okay. All right, we'll stop there.